We often gaze upon the medieval world as a tapestry of myth and legend, a stage for noble knights, grand quests, and romantic chivalry. But behind the shining armor and the castle walls, a different story unfolded. It is a story of hardship, of quiet struggles, and of the profound resilience of those whose lives were shaped by the brutal realities of their age. Tonight, we will not speak of valor and honor, but of the silent rhythms that dictated life on the edge of survival. This is a story that has been largely untold, a forgotten chapter of human history. This is a story of the children, not as spectators, but as participants, the quiet, often invisible, combatants in the grim dance of medieval warfare. We will explore the forces that thrust them into this world, the roles they were forced to play, and the enduring echoes of their sacrifice. Welcome to a history that is not for the faint of heart, but for those who seek to understand the full weight of the past. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture, if you will, a landscape not unlike the one you might imagine from a child's storybook. Deep green hills rolling endlessly into the horizon, ancient, sprawling forests that whispered secrets of forgotten ages, and countless villages nestled beside winding rivers. The occasional sentinel of a stone castle, mighty and imposing, would break the natural flow of the land, a stark reminder of human dominion. But this seemingly ordered world, governed by the predictable rhythms of the seasons and the comforting arc of the sun, was in truth a crucible forged in iron necessity. It was a realm relentlessly driven by the insatiable demands of powerful lords and the quiet, yet absolute, obligation that served as the very bedrock of medieval society. At the heart of this intricate existence lay the feudal system, a vast, complex, and unyielding web of reciprocal duty and unwavering service. Within this system, the military obligation wasn't merely a suggestion or a temporary requirement. It was a fundamental, inherent part of existence, binding virtually all social classes, from the most exalted noble to the lowliest, earthbound serf. This wasn't a choice for most. It was a birthright, an expectation that permeated the very air, thick with the scent of damp earth and the comforting aroma of wood smoke from countless hearths. This rhythm, much like a slow, steady heartbeat, dictated the very shape of life itself. Wake, eat, rest, and then the cycle began anew. The sun would dutifully rise and set. The fields would be tilled with aching backs and harvested with hopeful hands, but the quiet, ever-present shadow of conflict was never truly far away. This shadow, an uninvited guest, was an ever-present reality, subtly but profoundly shaping the choices, the fears, and the desperate hopes of every man, woman, and, tragically, every child. For a powerful lord, the demand for men-at-arms was not a fleeting concern but a constant, almost imperceptible hum of necessity in the background of their lives. A castle, in this age, was far more than just a home. It was an impregnable military stronghold, and its lord was not merely a landowner overseeing his estates, but a seasoned commander, perpetually responsible for the defense of his lands and the projection of his power. To meet this ceaseless need for a robust fighting force, lords meticulously cultivated a steady stream of new recruits, a practice that, startlingly, often began with the children within their own households or those of their loyal vassals. For a noble child, particularly a boy, this path was not an optional pursuit or passing fancy. It was a core and utterly essential part of their upbringing, a fundamental inheritance of a relentlessly violent world. This rigorous indoctrination into the martial arts often commenced as early as the tender age of 7. At this formative moment, a boy, still undeniably a child, would be sent away from the familiar comforts and protective embrace of his own family, dispatched to another lord's distant household. This wasn't just a move, it was a profound transformation, an immersion into a world governed by strict hierarchy and martial discipline. It was a solemn education, a rigorous and often brutal apprenticeship in the arts of war and the complex, often contradictory, rules of chivalry. This was a meticulously structured path, a life of unwavering service that was not only expected but ingrained from a very young age. These boys, serving initially as pages and later progressing to the more demanding role of squires, were integral parts of a lord's retinue. From their earliest days, they were systematically taught the rituals of violence, the unspoken code of honor, and the grim realities of medieval combat. The daily reality of a page's life was an exacting mixture of domestic service and an unceasing regimen of early military training. Their days would be filled with tasks designed to build both discipline and physical strength, serving at table with quiet efficiency, meticulously cleaning armor and weapons, and attending to the every need of the lord and his family. Their small hands, though still developing, would quickly grow calloused with the constant work, a tangible sign of a young life being slowly but surely molded into a precision tool of war. The martial lessons would begin with light wooden swords and crude practice bows, the weight and feel of them becoming as familiar to their young hands as the rhythm of their own breath. This was not merely physical training. It was an education in absolute obedience, unwavering endurance, and the subtle, often unspoken, language of the battlefield. The biting frost would chew at their fingertips during morning drills, a subtle yet constant reminder of the cold, unyielding world they inhabited. The quiet, rhythmic clatter of hooves over cobblestones from the stables and the distant, guttural shouts of men-at-arms during drills were the pervasive sounds that shaped their formative childhoods, imprinting the realities of war onto their very souls. This was a day like any other. Yes, a day of demanding work, of gnawing hunger assuaged by simple fare, of fleeting small kindnesses and profound, often unspoken, sorrows, a rhythm as ancient and unyielding as the world itself. The life of a page was a perpetual lesson in the intricate dance of hierarchy and power. He was a servant, certainly, performing menial tasks, but he was simultaneously an apprentice warrior, and the distinction between these two roles was often deliberately blurred. He was taught to stand in the respectful presence of his betters, to speak only when explicitly spoken to, and to carry out his duties with unquestioning obedience, knowing that even the smallest lapse could have severe consequences. The epic stories of heroic knights, their gleaming armor, and glorious, bloody battles were meticulously woven into the very fabric of his education, serving as a constant, powerful reminder of the noble purpose that his burgeoning hardships were meant to serve. He would witness firsthand the elaborate rituals of the court, the solemn oaths of fealty sworn between lords, the intricate political maneuvering, and the quiet, simmering tensions that could, at a moment's notice, erupt into devastating violence. He would learn the painstaking art of polishing intricate armor until it gleamed, of meticulously caring for a knight's war horse, and of standing silently by, an unmoving shadow, as his lord made weighty decisions that would reverberate through the lives of countless others. This wasn't merely a physical education designed to hone his body. It was a profound psychological conditioning, meticulously crafted to prepare a young mind for the brutal realities of command, the weight of responsibility, and the unforgiving nature of conflict. Yet, this noble path, while brutal, was only one part of the story, a small, if significant, sliver of the full, brutal tapestry of medieval child soldiery. The larger, and undeniably more tragic, reason for the widespread use of child soldiers was the harsh, unyielding poverty that defined so many lives during this unforgiving era. For the vast majority of the peasant classes, life was a constant, brutal, and often losing struggle for sheer survival. catastrophic events, the devastating famines that relentlessly gnawed at the edges of every winter, the sweeping, indiscriminate devastation of the Black Death which could wipe out entire villages in a matter of weeks, and the constant threat of localized conflicts shattered what little social structures existed and left countless families in a state of quiet, desperate fragility. The very air could feel thick with a palpable fear of want, a constant, underlying anxiety that pressed in on every humble home, making each day a perilous tightrope walk. In such an unforgiving world, a child, far from being a blessing, could tragically become another hungry mouth to feed, an unbearable burden that might finally break a struggling family already teetering on the brink of collapse. For these children, military service, with its alluring yet often false promise of a warm meal and a precarious place to sleep, became not a noble calling, but a desperate, final path to survival, a fragile, flickering hope in the face of absolute starvation and utter destitution. Though it carried with it an immense and terrifying risk of death. For some, military service, in its rawest form, offered a rare and desperate opportunity to escape the crushing generational cycle of poverty and perhaps even, against all odds, to rise, however incrementally, within a rigid, unforgiving, and deeply class-based society. This was a day like any other, until the quiet, yet earth-shattering, message arrived. A local lord was raising an army, and every able body, no matter how small or how young, was urgently needed. This was the same unforgiving world that also gave rise to the ubiquitous camp followers, a pitiable assembly of children who scavenged relentlessly for scraps of food, discarded supplies, and any meager resource that might sustain them. These children were often pressed into service as messengers, their small size and agility making them difficult targets, as spies, their innocence often disarming, or as lookouts, their sharp young eyes scanning the horizon for danger. Mercenary companies, those professional purveyors of violence that were abundant throughout the medieval era, often actively recruited children. This was a pragmatic choice, a way to cheaply fill their ranks and to perform menial but often incredibly dangerous tasks that older, more valuable soldiers would refuse. For a child with absolutely no prospects, whose stomach was a constant, aching void, the promise of a crust of bread and a precarious roof over their head, however temporary or fleeting, was an almost irresistible lure. This was not a life of glory or honor, but a life of constant, brutal struggle for sheer survival. His hands, perpetually raw and chapped from exposure, his worn boots, always damp from the mud and dew, but the bread, always warm at noon, a small miracle. The promise of that solitary, fleeting comfort, of a temporarily full stomach, could be enough to draw a child into a life of unimaginable hardship, violence, and despair. The church, a pervasive and constant presence in every corner of medieval life, from the grand cathedrals to the smallest village chapels, played a complex and often deeply contradictory role in this grim reality. While its lofty teachings theoretically condemned violence and championed the sanctity of human life, the Church was, in practice, deeply intertwined with the very fabric of the feudal system. Its own power and wealth were often derived from feudal grants, and its clergy frequently served as advisors and even military leaders. Consequently, it rarely, if ever, spoke out definitively or forcefully against the use of children in warfare. Instead, the Church often tacitly approved of it, couching the grim, pragmatic reality in the lofty, often manipulative, language of a righteous, holy cause. The infamous Children's Crusade of 1212, a historical enigma whose true nature is still debated, whether a genuine crusade composed primarily of children or tragic, mass migration of the utterly impoverished, stands as a quiet, haunting testament to the profound vulnerability and exploitation of young people under the guise of fervent religious zeal. Their desperate journey, a pilgrimage born of unimaginable desperation and a simple, quiet faith, was a chilling example of a world that was not only willing but actively encouraged its most vulnerable to march, fight, and ultimately die for an abstract ideal. It was a world where even the profound concept of faith could be distorted and wielded as a powerful tool to put a child in unimaginable harm's way. A world where the promise of a holy reward in the afterlife was cynically used to justify the brutal, violent reality of child soldiers in the here and now. And so, what did these young, fragile lives look like when they found themselves on the unforgiving expanse of the medieval battlefield? They were not merely passive observers, shielded from the carnage. They were, in chilling reality, active participants. For the noble-born, they served as pages and squires, performing crucial but inherently dangerous duties. They fetched weapons for their beleaguered lords, held the reins of agitated war horses amidst the chaos, and carried the heavy, often unwieldy banners that marked their lord's precise location in the swirling fray. They were not merely assistants or appendages. They were often situated in the very heart of the action, a small, vulnerable shadow moving frantically alongside a towering, heavily armored knight, their young lives hanging precariously on the whim of a stray arrow, a glancing blow, or a single, fatal misstep in the churned mud. For the children of the peasantry, their duties were often even more grim and exposed. Their smaller stature and surprising dexterity sometimes made them remarkably useful as archers, especially in large-scale siege warfare, where their sheer numbers, though individually small, could be a terrible, beautiful asset, a relentless hail of arrows aimed at the besieged. They would also be tasked with the back-breaking labor of carrying heavy rocks or aiding in the construction of massive siege engines, placing them in direct, constant harm's way, exposed to a relentless barrage of enemy arrows, crossbow bolts, and the devastating impact of trebuchet-launched projectiles. Their role was a terrifying paradox, both absolutely essential to the war effort and, simultaneously, utterly expendable in the eyes of their commanders. The battlefield itself was a horrifying tableau of fallen men, a quiet, sickening spectacle of humanity laid low, and countless young lives were gently, brutally cut short, extinguished before they had truly begun. This was the unvarnished reality that these children were born into, the brutal, unyielding landscape of their truncated youth. This was their world, a sprawling tapestry intricately woven with countless threads of unyielding duty, desperate survival, and a quiet, often desperate, faith. A day like any other, perhaps, in its relentless cycle. But not quite. This was a day of war, a day when the quiet, insidious message of violence came to claim its own, demanding the ultimate price from the innocent. The echoing memory of the past presses in, a stark reminder that for far too many, childhood in the medieval era was not a sanctuary of innocence and play, but a constant, harrowing struggle for survival in a world that, with chilling indifference, saw them as nothing more than small, expendable soldiers. The quiet clatter of hooves over cobblestones, the distant, guttural shouts of men-at-arms, and the mournful cries of the wounded were the indelible sounds that shaped their days, their nights, and tragically, their entire, brief lives. For the noble-born boy, the journey from the fleeting innocence of childhood to the grim reality of a seasoned warrior was not merely a path, but a long, arduous, and often brutal climb. It was a formal apprenticeship in the very art of war, a demanding education that transcended mere skill to encompass discipline, endurance, and an almost spiritual connection to violence. This education was a structured and unforgiving process, meticulously designed for survival in a world where a single misplaced step, a moment of hesitation, or a lapse in judgment could lead to a swift, violent, and agonizing end. This was emphatically not a game. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of innocence and a gradual, methodical reshaping of a child's pliable mind and body into a precise, lethal weapon. The journey, fraught with peril and deprivation, began at the tender age of 7, a pivotal moment when a boy, no more than a child in stature and experience, will be wrenched from the familiar comforts and protective embrace of his own family, dispatched to another lord's household to begin his new, often terrifying, life as a page. This was, by all accounts, a rough and tumble education, a world utterly removed from the cherished comforts of his own family, where his nascent duties were a carefully orchestrated mixture of domestic service and the first, foundational steps of military training. His days would begin long before the first hint of dawn crept over the castle walls. The biting, frigid air a constant companion as he rose from his thin pallet to attend to his lot. He would fetch cool water for the wash basin, his small hands carefully pouring, meticulously brush the heavy, often mud-caked wool of a cloak until it was pristine and presentable, and stand in silent, unwavering attention as the day's critical plans were laid out in the echoing vastness of the great hall. This hall, with its roaring central fire casting dancing shadows and its acoustics amplifying every utterance, was not just a grand room. It was his new home, his first, formidable classroom. Here, amidst the comings and goings of knights, ladies, and petitioners, he would absorb the intricate, often unwritten, rules of courtly etiquette, the subtle, unspoken language of deference and hierarchy, and the paramount importance of silent, unquestioning service to his liege. He learned, with a keen observational eye, to anticipate his lord's every need without a single word being spoken, a fresh goblet of wine, a discarded gauntlet, a subtle gesture for a scribe. He was taught to move through a crowded room with a delicate blend of purpose and humility, to blend into the background, and to absorb the countless, unspoken lessons of power and authority that were taught simply by observing the daily ebb and flow of nobility. He was, in essence, a ghost in the great hall, a small, quiet shadow learning the paradoxical art of being seen and not heard, to be present yet invisible, a constant, silent witness to the intricate, often dangerous, dance of feudal power. He would watch the quiet tension etched in the lord's eyes as he spoke of rival dukes and border skirmishes, the swift, decisive movements of the master-at-arms as he prepared for a dangerous hunt, and the silent, unspoken grief of a mother who had just received grim news of a son lost to a far-off conflict. The very air around him was thick with these quiet, profound lessons, and the page's young mind, sharp and impressionable, absorbed them all, forming the foundational layers of his future warrior's self. The true education, however, began in earnest after the morning meal, in the muddy, echoing expanse of the castle bailey or the vast training grounds beyond the walls. Here, surrounded by the towering, unyielding stone of the fortress, his immersion in the raw reality of violence commenced. He would spend long, grueling hours on the training grounds, his small body aching from the relentless strain, muscles burning with exertion. The early stages of military training were painstakingly basic, focusing on fundamental movements with heavy wooden swords and crude practice bows, unyielding companions that taught him the essential motions of thrusts, parries, blocks, and fighting stances. The rhythmic sound of wood on wood, the guttural grunt of exertion from himself and his peers, and the quiet, stern commands of the master-at-arms were the pervasive soundtrack to his youth, a rhythm that was both punishing and profoundly educational, etching themselves into his very being. He was taught not just to wield a weapon, but to truly parry with a shield, to feint with a blade to deceive an opponent, and to loose an arrow with a burgeoning precision that would one day keep him, and his lord, alive. The lessons were relentlessly repetitive, grueling to the point of exhaustion, and utterly unforgiving, a constant test of his burgeoning will and his young body's physical limits. He would be made to stand for what felt like an eternity in a defensive stance, his small muscles trembling uncontrollably with fatigue, until the position became not merely learned, but second nature, an automatic response. He would run countless laps around the bailey, often in a heavy leather jerkin, the sweat stinging his eyes, meticulously building the raw endurance needed for a long march or protracted battle. As the boy grew in strength, stature, and skill, the training would inevitably progress to real, scaled-down weapons. A small, but sharp, sword, a light, but deadly, spear, a short-bladed dagger, where the risk of serious injury was not theoretical, but high, and the consequences of even a minor mistake were immediate and real. He would learn the grim, visceral lesson that a moment of hesitation, a lapse in concentration, could cost him a finger, or worse, his life. This was not a game. It was a constant, visceral, and terrifying preparation for a life defined by violence, a world where the ability to fight, and fight well, was often the only guarantee of survival. Alongside this meticulous weapon training was a rigorous, all-encompassing program of physical conditioning. He would be expected to practice daily jousting drills on a static wooden horse, a heavy lance clutched firmly in his hands, learning to aim and hold steady against an imaginary foe. He would ride tirelessly across the Lord's sprawling lands until his legs screamed with agony and his hands were raw and chafed from the constant friction of the reins, building the equestrian skills so vital to a medieval warrior. He would engage in general combat drills designed to build raw strength, explosive power, and unwavering endurance. Every fall from a horse, every painful bruise from a training bout, every moment of utter exhaustion was a crucial lesson in survival, a quiet, insistent message to his body that it had to be stronger, faster, and more resilient to endure the far greater horrors of the battles to come. At the age of 14, if he had successfully survived the relentless rigors of his page training and demonstrated sufficient promise, the page would make the crucial and significantly more dangerous transition to squire. This was the final, and arguably most perilous, step toward the coveted status of knighthood. A squire was far more than a mere servant. He was a knight's shadow, a constant, ever-present companion to a fully armored knight, his very existence revolving around his master's needs. His duties were intensely demanding and critically important, a life of constant subservience interwoven with profound danger. He was solely responsible for maintaining his knight's intricate armor and razor-sharp weapons, a painstaking process that required hours of meticulous polishing, sharpening, and intricate repair to ensure every piece of gear was absolutely battle-ready. He would care for his knight's horse, a powerful and incredibly valuable war machine in its own right, grooming it, feeding it, and ensuring its readiness. Crucially, he would provide critical assistance to his master on the chaotic, brutal battlefield. This was a world of unceasing physical labor and quiet, unyielding expectation, where the squire's devotion to his knight was absolute. The squire's life was a delicate, constant balance of personal servitude and demanding apprenticeship, a perpetual state of readiness. He would accompany his knight on every endeavor, on dangerous hunts through dense forests, on weary patrols along contested borders, into the glittering yet treacherous courts of other lords. He learned not from formal lessons, but by meticulously observing his knight's every move, every word, every decision. He was the one who woke his knight in the pre-dawn chill, helped him into his heavy, suffocating armor, piece by agonizing piece, and served as his eyes and ears in a treacherous world where true trust was an invaluable, rare luxury. He was a shield bearer, a sword carrier, a constant, vigilant presence, his life a quiet, devoted echo of his knights. He was a silent, solemn student of the grim art of war, learning not from dusty books, but from a visceral, immediate example of a man who lived and breathed violence, honor, and survival. He would witness the casual, swift violence of the age, a bandit summarily executed, a peasant beaten for insolence, the swift, often brutal, justice meted out by a lord, and the quiet, simmering resentment of the peasantry beneath the iron heel of feudal power. The world itself was his brutal, living textbook, and he was a student who literally could not afford to fail, for failure often meant death. On the field of battle, the squire was not a distant observer, safely tucked away from the fray. He was an active, critical participant, a vital, irreplaceable link in the chain of command and survival. His primary role was to stand by his knight's side, often exposed to the same dangers, ready at a moment's notice to hand him a new shield if his was shattered, to retrieve a spare lance from the ground, or to help him quickly mount a fresh horse when his own was fallen or wounded. But in the utter chaos and brutal fluidity of a medieval battle, the meticulously drawn line between assistance and direct combat was often not just blurred, but completely erased. A squire would frequently find himself thrust directly into the thick of the fighting, often instinctively using his own body or discarded shield to protect his knight from a lethal blow, or using a small dagger to finish a downed enemy who still posed a threat. They were, in chilling reality, just as likely to be killed as any fully armed man on the field, a grim and undeniable reality that underscored the brutal, deadly nature of their apprenticeship. They were not children anymore, not in the soft, protected sense of the word, but small, vulnerable soldiers, their lives hanging precariously on the whim of a stray arrow, the devastating swing of an axe, or the silent, swift thrust of an enemy spear. The cacophony of battle, the guttural roar of thousands of men, the deafening clang of steel on steel, the piercing shriek of a wounded horse, the cries of the dying, were the final and most brutal lessons of their training. A squire had to learn not just to survive in this maelstrom of chaos, but to move effectively within it, to anticipate his knight's desperate needs in the middle of a swirling melee, and to somehow keep a level head and a clear mind when all around him was utter madness and carnage. He would witness horrors that would permanently scar even a hardened grown man, and he would have to learn, quickly and profoundly, to live with them, to bury the primal fear, the shock, and the burgeoning trauma beneath a thick, impenetrable layer of quiet, cold resolve. The ultimate goal for these noble children, the shining prize at the end of this harrowing crucible, was the coveted status of knighthood. It was a formal, public recognition of their arduous passage from a child rigorously trained for war to a man utterly defined by it. The solemn ritual of knighthood, with its vigil, its sacred vows, and the symbolic, reverent touch of a lord's sword on the shoulder, was a quiet, yet profoundly significant moment. It marked the definitive end of a long, brutal journey through adolescence and the beginning of a life of constant violence, unwavering service, and often early death. But this journey, this transformation, came at an immense, often invisible, psychological and emotional cost. A child who survived this relentlessly brutal upbringing was, in essence, forged by the very violence he was meant to wield. He was systematically taught to suppress his natural fear, to view the pain and suffering of others as a normal, unavoidable part of life, and to embrace the cold, detached, almost inhuman logic of war. His very humanity, his empathy, was blunted. The emotional scars of this profound experience were often invisible to the naked eye, hidden deep beneath the stoic facade of a medieval warrior, a quiet, internal wound that would irrevocably shape the man he would become. His innocence was not simply lost. It was a devastating casualty of a world that demanded his youth, his burgeoning strength, and, if necessary, his very life, all for the fleeting honor and obligation of a knighthood. A man who had been a child soldier, who had navigated the grim realities of medieval training, could never truly go back to what he once was. The experience had fundamentally and irrevocably changed him, a quiet, haunting testament to the harsh realities of a world where childhood was a cherished luxury few could genuinely afford. He would forever carry the weight of his brutal past not as an external burden, but as an intrinsic part of his very being, a silent, ever-present reminder of the unforgiving world that had forged him into the warrior he was. He would be a man of steel, outwardly formidable and unyielding, but inside, a ghost of the child he once was would inevitably remain, a silent, haunting presence in the silent chambers of his soul. Now, our gaze must turn to a much larger, and far more tragic, population. These were the children of the peasantry, the urban poor, and the countless landless wanderers who drifted across the medieval landscape. They had no access to a learned master at arms, no intricate code of chivalry to guide their actions, and certainly no gleaming promise of knighthood awaiting them at the end of their ordeal. They were the forgotten foot soldiers, the true cannon fodder of the medieval era, whose grim fate was not a matter of choice, but of simple, unyielding, desperate necessity. Their harrowing stories are not etched into the grand tapestries that adorn castle walls, nor are they immortalized in the soaring verses of epic poems. Instead, their narratives are found in the quiet, heartbreaking details gleaned from the margins of history, a mournful, whispered song of a world that, in its brutal pragmatism, had no true place for them, save as tools of war. For the vast majority of the peasant classes, life was a constant, brutal struggle, a precarious existence teetering perpetually on the brink of subsistence. The sudden, unwelcome arrival of war, with its demands and its destruction, could shatter this fragile existence in an instant, plunging entire communities into chaos and despair. During a time of widespread conflict, a lord would not, indeed could not, rely solely on his limited number of knights and their rigorously trained squires. His ambitions, his defense, and his very survival depended on sheer numbers. Thus, he would issue a call for a peasant levi, a system of mass conscription that swept through the countryside like an inexorable tide. Entire villages could be emptied of their able-bodied men, a quiet, irresistible force that, in a grim twist of fate, frequently swept up many young boys as well. These were emphatically not volunteers responding to a call for glory. They were forced recruits, ripped from their families, stripped of their innocence, and brutally thrust into the ranks of a hastily assembled, poorly equipped army. Picture, if you dare, a boy no older than 10, his hands still soft, uncalloused, and accustomed only to the light chores of a childhood spent in fields, now standing in a ragged line alongside hardened, weathered men. In his trembling grasp, he might hold a rusty scythe, reap a pose from the harvest, or a heavy, crudely fashioned club. His shield was often little more than a splintered piece of wood scavenged from a broken wagon wheel, offering scant protection against a blade or an arrow. Their equipment was a cruel, stark testament to their perceived low value. A simple leather cap, patched and worn, a coarse, patched tunic that barely offered warmth, and a weapon not forged for the intricacies of battle, but crudely adapted from the tools of the fields or the hunt. They were, in the cold calculus of medieval warfare, the disposable soldiers, their astonishingly high casualty rates a grim, unspoken reality that was simply, utterly accepted as the unavoidable cost of conflict. They became a band of brothers, not forged in the crucible of shared glory or noble cause, but in the white-hot furnace of shared terror, their only bond a common, pervasive fear of the next battle, a bond as surprisingly strong as it was fragile, mirroring the precarious lives they led. They would march for days on end, often with little to no food and even less water, their feet raw, blistered, and bleeding, their young bodies aching with a profound, bone-deep fatigue that no farm chore, however arduous, could ever replicate. They were frequently the vanguard, the first to be sent into a skirmish, their young lives a cheap, acceptable price to pay for the preservation of more valuable, armored men whose training and equipment represented a significant investment. The most common, and arguably most brutal, use of these children was in the long, grinding tedium of siege warfare. A medieval siege was not a swift, decisive assault. It was a slow, agonizing war of attrition, a test of patience, resources, and sheer, unyielding will, often stretching for months or even years. And these children were, shockingly, often at the very heart of this grinding struggle, performing the most dangerous, thankless tasks. They might be tasked with carrying incredibly heavy rocks to the front lines, their small shoulders straining under the immense, crushing weight, to be loaded into the gaping maw of trebuchets and flung with devastating force at the unyielding castle walls. They would haul overflowing buckets of water or dangerously hot oil up to the battlements, a slow, arduous, and perilous climb up a precarious wooden ladder, their small, vulnerable bodies a quiet, fleeting target for the castle's archers perched above. Their nimble fingers and deceptively small stature sometimes made them tragically useful for digging tunnels beneath a castle's foundations, a terrifying and claustrophobic task where the slightest miscalculation or the merest whisper of sound could bring the entire tunnel crashing down, burying them alive. Their lives during a siege were a constant, quiet gamble against the whistle of an unseen arrow, the sickening thud of a falling rock, or the terrifying threat of a collapsing trench or tunnel. The deafening thud of the trebuchet, the deadly rain of arrows, and the piercing screams of the dying were the visceral, unyielding lessons of their brutal education, lessons learned not gradually, but in a single, terrifying, indelible moment. For these children, the world was an inescapable cacophony of violence and a quiet, ever-present, existential threat. Beyond the conscripted villages, there was a whole other world of children who were born directly into the shadow of perpetual war, the urban street children and the desperate camp followers. These were the scavengers of war, a nomadic, often invisible, and utterly desperate population of children and young teenagers who followed armies as they marched inexorably across the land, their movements dictated by the shifting tides of conflict. They were motivated by a single, unyielding, and primal necessity: survival. They scavenged relentlessly for food and supplies from the discarded leftovers of a battle, digging with desperate hands through the grim, often bloody, aftermath for anything of value: a dropped coin, a discarded piece of bread, a scrap of usable cloth. They would often be pressed into service as messengers, their small size and surprising speed allowing them to slip through enemy lines and guarded checkpoints where an adult, with their more imposing presence, would almost certainly be caught, interrogated, and executed. They were the quiet spies, their innocent appearance disarming, the vigilant lookouts, their sharp young eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ones who would carry a desperate, life-or-death message from one general to another, their young lives hanging precariously on the thread of a single, fateful moment. Mercenary companies, which were abundant and influential in the medieval era, often actively recruited these children as a pragmatic, cheap way to fill their ranks and to perform the most menial but incredibly dangerous tasks that older, more experienced soldiers would rightfully refuse. For a child with absolutely no prospects, no family, and a constant, gnawing hunger in his stomach, the meager promise of a crust of stale bread and a temporary, fleeting place by a communal fire was an overwhelmingly powerful lure, a lifeline in an otherwise hopeless existence. This was not a life of glory, of honor, or of grand battles, but a life of constant, grinding struggle, a quiet, brutal existence that inexorably shaped them into hardened, cynical survivors, far older than their years. They were a part of the army, existing in its periphery, but they were never truly of the army in spirit or status. They were shadows, moving silently on the periphery, their very existence a quiet, haunting testament to the chaos, indifference, and utter brutality of the age. The brutal, visceral reality of combat, witnessed and participated in at such a tender age, left an indelible and profound mark on these children, a deep psychological trauma that was neither understood nor addressed in their time. They witnessed and, horrifyingly, committed acts of violence far beyond their comprehension of their years, and there was no concept, no framework, for what we now clinically call post-traumatic stress disorder. There was only the brutal, unyielding expectation to endure, to bury the searing fear, the profound shock, and the burgeoning trauma beneath a thick, impenetrable layer of quiet, unwavering resolve. The emotional scars of this horrific experience were often invisible, hidden deep within the psyche, a quiet, internal wound that would irrevocably shape the person he would become for the rest of his life. For these children, the battlefield was not a distant, abstract concept glimpsed in stories, but a daily, immediate reality, and the unspeakable horrors they witnessed and endured would haunt them for the rest of their days, a quiet, internal war that never truly ended. They would forever carry the memory of the men they killed, the men they saw die in agony, and the countless small, brutal acts of survival that defined their stolen youth. For those few who miraculously survived the relentless violence of their soldiering, the physical cost was often immense and permanent. The probability of sustaining serious injury, disfigurement, or chronic illness was extraordinarily high, and the almost complete lack of proper medical care for those who survived their wounds was a grim, undeniable reality. A simple wound, if left untended or poorly treated, could quickly become a death sentence, a festering infection that slowly and agonizingly claimed a life. A shattered limb meant a permanent end to any chance of a normal, productive life, leaving a boy with nothing but the searing memory of his suffering and the grim, crushing reality of a permanent, often debilitating, disability. These were not the chivalric, honorable wounds of a knight, which might be treated with care and attention, but brutal, unglamorous injuries that left them with nothing but pain and despair. For those who somehow survived this living hell and were eventually discharged from service, the only life they truly knew was violence and the desperate struggle it entailed. A child who learned, from his earliest, most impressionable years, to kill, to steal, and to scavenge simply to survive would find it utterly impossible to return to a peaceful, settled life. Many who found their way back to their home villages did so only to be met with suspicion, fear, and silent shunning, becoming a quiet, disturbing reminder of a world they no longer truly belonged to. Many more, unable to integrate back into civilian life or find any other means of sustenance, inevitably turned to a life of banditry or crime, continuing the only existence they knew how to navigate, a life spent on the perilous fringes of a society that had brutally used them and then, with chilling indifference, cast them aside. This was the quiet, tragic fate of the forgotten foot soldiers, a life that often began in a fleeting moment of innocence and ended in a brutal, silent sorrow that echoed through their shortened, scarred lives. The quiet clatter of hooves over cobblestones and the distant, haunting shouts of men-at-arms were the pervasive, inescapable sounds that shaped their days, their nights, and tragically, their entire, stolen lives, a haunting echo of a brutal, unyielding world that consumed its young with chilling regularity. The quiet sorrows and brutal necessities of the peasant Levi and the child scavenger were but one side of a multifaceted and deeply disturbing coin. Now, we must turn our gaze to specific, documented instances, the vivid historical brushstrokes that illuminate the grim realities of medieval child soldiery. We move beyond the anonymous suffering to confront the named and the notorious, to give weight to individual tragedies. This chapter will meticulously use specific battles and sieges as crucial anchors for our understanding, grounding the phenomenon in tangible historical events. Simultaneously, We will dive deep into the pervasive societal attitudes and the nascent psychological frameworks that not only allowed such a chilling phenomenon to exist, but astonishingly, to be a normalized, and at times, even celebrated, component of warfare. The stories of these children are not merely footnotes relegated to the back of a battle report. They are the very resilient threads that intricately weave the complex, often unsettling, tapestry of medieval war. We will unflinchingly explore the lives of the noble and the common, the willingly sacrificed and the tragically conscripted, to expose a world where the very concept of a protected childhood was a fragile luxury, utterly unattainable for the vast majority, rather than a universal, inherent right. The overarching goal here is to transition from the general, broad strokes of suffering to the specific, to give faces, however fleeting, and names, however few, to the immense suffering, and to dissect the deeply unsettling moral framework of an era that, with chilling pragmatism, viewed the lives of children as a cheap, and often lamentably necessary, sacrifice. The year 1346 marked a pivotal and blood-soaked moment in the protracted 100 Years' War, a seemingly endless clash of empires that would forever reshape the face of European warfare. The Battle of Crécy, a stunning and decisive English victory, stands as a testament not only to the tactical genius of King Edward III but also to the devastating raw power of the English longbow. But amidst the thunderous charge of hooves, the chilling cries of men, and the relentless rain of arrows, two profoundly distinct narratives of child soldiers emerged, each telling a vastly different, yet equally disturbing, story about their precarious place in this violent world. At the very heart of the English army, a figure of immense significance stood on the cusp of manhood, poised for his terrifying initiation. Edward, Prince of Wales, a mere 16 years old at the time, was about to experience his first true taste of battle, a baptism by fire that would forge his legend. Known to history as the Black Prince due to the color of his armor, his imposing presence on the battlefield was far from a mere act of symbolic showmanship. He was a genuine commander, tasked with the weighty responsibility of leading the right flank of the English army, a position of extreme peril and strategic importance. The Battle of Crécy, however, would prove to be a brutal and almost fatal initiation. As the French cavalry, in a series of disorganized but ferociously determined assaults, crashed against the English lines, Edward's division found itself in grave, almost insurmountable peril, their ranks threatening to buckle under the relentless pressure. In this moment of profound crisis, his seasoned commanders, acutely fearing for the young prince's very life, sent a desperate, urgent plea to his father, King Edward III, imploring him for immediate reinforcements. The king's now famous and chillingly pragmatic response, "Let the boy win his space," speaks volumes about the unyielding culture of the medieval aristocracy. It was not an act of callous indifference, but a brutal, deliberate test of courage, leadership, and resilience, a cold and calculated expectation that a young noble, even one of royal blood and immense privilege, must endure an agonizing trial by combat to earn his rightful place among men and to prove his worthiness for command. The experience was undoubtedly horrific, a maelstrom of sensory overload and profound terror. The guttural sounds of men screaming in agony, the sickening smell of fresh blood mingling with sweat and fear, the sheer, unbridled brutality of hand-to-hand combat, all would have been seared irrevocably into the young prince's memory, leaving a lasting, indelible impression that would fundamentally shape his identity as a warrior and a leader for the rest of his life. For the nobility, the use of children, or rather, young adolescents, in war was not only accepted but meticulously framed as a noble rite of passage, a glorious and necessary self-sacrifice for a greater cause that was romanticized and celebrated in countless songs, poems, and intricate tapestries. This pervasive narrative, while undeniably romantic and deeply idealized, served a crucial purpose: to subtly obscure the brutal, visceral reality of what a boy of 16 truly endured, both physically and psychologically, in such a terrifying melee yet, a few short yards away from the prince's embattled flank. Another, far more tragic and anonymous story was unfolding. The English longbow was a weapon of unparalleled lethality and devastating range, and its devastating effectiveness was a key, if not the key, factor in the English victory at Crécy. But to truly master the longbow, to wield it with the precision and power required for mass destruction, demanded a lifetime of dedicated training, a demanding commitment that invariably began in the earliest stages of childhood. Young boys, often from impoverished peasant families, were taken from their homes and trained from a very early age, their small hands learning to draw a heavy, unforgiving bowstring that would eventually become an instrument of death on an industrial scale. At Crécy, these archer boys stood in disciplined ranks, their small, unassuming bodies a quiet, almost heartbreaking testament to their long, arduous, and brutal training. They were not commanders, princes, or even knights. They were merely cogs in a deadly military machine, their individual identities subsumed by their collective purpose. Their disciplined volleys, unleashed in a deadly cloud of arrows that literally blotted out the sun, were a key, decisive factor in breaking the French cavalry charge, a powerful and undeniable demonstration of the horrifying effectiveness of trained child soldiers. But unlike the Black Prince, there was no glorious narrative of honor, no poetic verses of chivalry, and no lasting fame attached to their anonymous lives. They were seen as utterly expendable tools of war, their lives valued little more than the arrows they fired. The Battle of Crécy, therefore, presents a perfect, stark dichotomy. The celebrated, romanticized narrative of the noble-born child soldier, and the brutal, anonymous, and far more common reality of the peasant child soldier. It chillingly illustrates a world where the inherent value of a child's life was determined not by their universal humanity, but by the cold, unforgiving calculus of their social class. While Crécy starkly highlighted the profound class divide in the use and perception of child soldiers, the Hussite Wars in Bohemia, unfolding in the 15th century, offer a starkly different and equally disturbing example of children in conflict. This was a war not of dynastic ambition, territorial gain, or feudal obligation, but of fervent religious zeal and ideological conviction. Following the execution of the influential reformer Jan Hus, the conflict quickly escalated into a horrifying total war, a desperate struggle for survival in which the traditional line between combatant and civilian was not just blurred, but utterly erased. In the raw, often chaotic accounts of the Hussite Wars, we find harrowing stories of children, both boys and girls, fighting with astonishing ferocity and devotion alongside their parents and entire families in the fierce defense of their faith and their way of life. These children were often not conscripted or forced into service in the traditional sense. Rather, they were active, if tragically indoctrinated, participants in a war driven by an all-consuming ideology. They were systematically taught, from their earliest years, to view their enemies as subhuman heretics, agents of the devil, and to believe with absolute conviction that their participation, even their violent acts, was a righteous and holy endeavor, a sure and celebrated path to salvation and eternal glory. They stood bravely, or perhaps desperately, on the makeshift barricades of their towns and villages, fighting with whatever improvised weapons they could grasp, farm tools, stones, small axes. Their young bodies a testament to the all-encompassing, unforgiving nature of religious conflict. The Hussite Wars were, at their core, a war of the people, waged by the people, and the children of Bohemia were, tragically, an integral part of that people, their young lives sacrificed on the altar of religious fervor. This case study provides a devastating and crucial example of how profound religious and ideological conflict can sweep up and consume an entire population, from the eldest to the youngest, effectively turning innocent children into zealous, unhesitating soldiers. It starkly demonstrates that a child's involvement in war could be a matter of fervent, indoctrinated belief, a desire for perceived righteousness, not merely an issue of economic necessity or feudal obligation. It stands as a terrifying example of how powerful ideology, particularly religious ideology, can be ruthlessly wielded to justify the widespread exploitation and sacrifice of the young. Following the stunning victory at Crécy, King Edward III of England, recognizing a crucial strategic opportunity, swiftly set his sights on the strategically vital port of Calais. The ensuing siege, which lasted for nearly a year, was not a swift, decisive battle but a prolonged, agonizing war of attrition, a slow, torturous test of will, resources, and human endurance that brought a different, equally devastating kind of suffering. For nearly an entire year, the beleaguered citizens of Calais bravely held out against the relentless English siege, enduring unimaginable hardship. As food supplies dwindled to nothing and fresh water became a precious commodity, the desperation within the city walls grew to a fever pitch. The iconic story of the 6 burghers of Calais, who were ordered to surrender themselves with ropes around their necks as a gesture of submission, is well known and often celebrated as an act of noble sacrifice. But in the background of this singular, dramatic narrative, another, far more pervasive and heartbreaking story unfolded, that of the city's countless children. These children were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They wielded no weapons and fought no battles. Yet, they were the war's most helpless and indiscriminate victims, suffering alongside their parents, their small, emaciated bodies a grim and silent testament to the indiscriminately cruel and brutal nature of siege warfare. In a desperate, agonizing attempt to save their lives from slow starvation, many parents were forced to endure the unbearable agony of watching as their own children were turned away from the city gates, pushed outside the walls by the desperate authorities, left to die in the cold, unforgiving, and desolate landscape outside the besieged city. While not active combatants, their tragic plight powerfully highlights the devastating, often unseen, impact of war on the most vulnerable and innocent. They were, in essence, used as desperate pawns in a cruel political game, their fragile lives a horrifying bargaining chip in a high-stakes negotiation between desperate defenders and a ruthless besieger. This narrative expands our understanding of child soldiers beyond the literal battlefield, to include the children who, though unarmed, were used as horrifying tools of attrition, their prolonged suffering a means to an end, a weapon in its own right. It chillingly demonstrates that even when a child is not armed or directly engaged in combat, they can still become a casualty of war in the most brutal, heartbreaking, and morally reprehensible way. The specific examples of Crécy, the Hussite Wars, and Calais, while diverse in their historical context and motivations, all converge on a single, profoundly unsettling conclusion. Medieval society was, by and large, shockingly indifferent to the plight of the child soldier, viewing their involvement as either necessary or even desirable. To truly comprehend this pervasive phenomenon, we must delve into the deeply ingrained societal attitudes and the nascent psychological theories that underpinned and ultimately sustained it. The very concept of childhood as a special, protected time, a period of innocence and development, is a relatively modern construct, a luxury largely born of later eras. In the medieval era, especially among the vast lower classes, children were often seen not as delicate beings to be nurtured, but as miniature adults. Their nascent labor a crucial, indispensable component of a family's precarious survival. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the household economy, whether in the fields, the workshop, or the domestic sphere. This pragmatic, often brutal, mindset extended directly to warfare. A child's life was not seen as inherently more valuable or sacred than an adult's, and their suffering, their injury, or their death was simply considered a grim, unavoidable reality of a brutal age, a cost of living in a world constantly embroiled in conflict. This pervasive societal indifference was not necessarily a sign of malicious intent, but rather a reflection of a world where life itself was cheap, precarious, and short, and death was an ever-present, familiar companion. Beyond mere indifference, there was often an active, if unconscious, effort to prepare a child for the grim act of killing. This was a psychological imperative driven by the necessities of total war. In the Hussite Wars and other fiercely ideological or religious conflicts, children were systematically taught to view their enemies not as fellow human beings, but as subhuman heretics, infidels, or agents of evil, making it psychologically easier, almost a moral obligation, for them to commit acts of extreme violence. This dehumanization was a powerful and insidious tool of war, a way to strip the enemy of their shared humanity, and to morally justify the most brutal acts of combat without fostering guilt or remorse in the young combatants. This psychological conditioning, often instilled through potent religious sermons, fervent political rhetoric, and community-wide indoctrination, effectively transformed children into shockingly effective killing machines, their nascent consciences quieted by the powerful, pervasive belief that their actions were righteous, divinely ordained, and essential for the survival of their faith or people. Finally, there was the pervasive and deeply ingrained narrative of glorious self-sacrifice and heroism. This idealized narrative, often deliberately employed to justify the use of children in combat, especially in the context of the Crusades, presented soldiering not as a brutal necessity but as a noble, even sacred, calling, a direct path to eternal salvation and martyrdom. This deeply romanticized view served to sanitize the brutal reality of a child's horrific death on the battlefield, transforming a tragic, untimely end into a heroic, divinely blessed martyrdom that would be celebrated for generations. This narrative was particularly effective in justifying the involvement of noble-born children, such as the Black Prince, whose brutal initiation was lauded and celebrated as a necessary, almost sacred, step on the path to knighthood and leadership. This created a profound, disturbing dual system of justification, one for the noble, rooted in the abstract ideals of chivalric honor and inherited duty, and one for the commoner, rooted in the harsh realities of economic necessity and fervent religious zeal. The individual, yet interconnected, stories of the Black Prince, the anonymous archer boys of Crécy, the zealously fighting Hussite children, and the starving, discarded children of Calais all converge on a single, unsettling, and heartbreaking conclusion. The medieval child soldier was a tragic product of their time, a vulnerable figure shaped by widespread societal indifference, crushing economic necessity, fervent ideological fervor, and a powerful, pervasive narrative that tragically masked the brutal reality of their stolen lives. These forgotten foot soldiers, whether noble or peasant, whether conscripted into service or driven by zealous belief, were all, in their essence, victims of a world that had no place for their innocence, a world that relentlessly demanded their sacrifice as a grim, unyielding, and lamentably accepted cost of war. Their silent suffering remains a haunting echo of a brutal, unyielding past that few truly comprehend. This chapter marks the poignant end of our journey through the brutal, often overlooked, history of medieval child soldiery. The quiet, mournful song of the forgotten foot soldiers, the chilling, zealous tales of the Hussite children, and the celebrated, yet no less brutal, story of the Black Prince are not merely historical curiosities to be examined and filed away. They are the fading shadows of a long, tragic era, a grim and persistent reminder of a world that was fundamentally, terrifyingly different from our own in its casual acceptance of child sacrifice. Yet, as we shall see, these shadows have not truly disappeared. They have merely shifted their forms, finding new, devastating battlefields in a new, and in many ways, no less cruel, age. The story of the medieval child soldier, therefore, is not just a tale of the distant past. It is a timeless and tragic human story that reminds us of humanity's enduring capacity for unimaginable violence and the devastating, intergenerational impact of conflict on the most vulnerable among us. The widespread, almost endemic, practice of child soldiery in the medieval era did not, as one might hope, disappear overnight in a sudden burst of enlightenment. Its decline was instead a slow, inexorable process, a gradual fading shadow brought on by the twin, powerful forces of rapidly changing military technology and slowly evolving societal attitudes. The gradual rise of centralized royal power, a defining hallmark of the late medieval and early modern periods, systematically replaced the chaotic, ad hoc, and often unreliable feudal levy system. Kings, driven by a desire to consolidate their authority and wage more effective, protracted wars, began to favor the establishment of professional, standing armies. These formidable forces were composed not of hastily conscripted peasants or eager young pages, but of paid professionals who willingly dedicated their entire adult lives to the demanding art of war. These were men who were trained for years, their bodies and minds honed to a razor's edge for the sole, grim purpose of fighting. This unprecedented professionalization of the military significantly reduced the inherent need for the indiscriminate conscription of entire villages, tragically including their children, and simultaneously rendered the widespread use of untrained youth less desirable and, crucially, far less effective on the evolving battlefield. The feudal lord, with his often ill-equipped peasant levi, gradually gave way to the royal general, commanding disciplined and highly specialized forces. The dramatic introduction of gunpowder and the subsequent development of more complex, destructive military tactics further accelerated this irreversible trend. The simple, brutal effectiveness of a longbow, while devastating in its time, was eventually surpassed by the calculated, devastating power of cannons, primitive muskets, and intricate, specialized siege engines. These revolutionary new weapons required a level of specialized knowledge, meticulous training, and physical maturity that was far beyond the innate capabilities of a 10-year-old boy armed with nothing more than a repurposed scythe or a crudely fashioned club. While a child could indeed learn to shoot a longbow with impressive accuracy and force, they could not realistically be a skilled cannoneer, a trained musketeer capable of intricate drills, or a master of complex siege mechanics. This burgeoning military specialization fundamentally transformed the battlefield, making the widespread use of children as foot soldiers a tragic relic of a bygone era, less effective and, therefore, less commonly employed. The battlefield, once a chaotic melee where any warm body might be useful, increasingly became a terrifying place reserved exclusively for professional soldiers, not for desperate children who had been thrust into the ranks with little more than a rusty weapon and a whispered prayer. This profound shift in military technology and organization, a true revolution in warfare, created an environment where the child soldier, as a pervasive and widely accepted phenomenon, could no longer realistically thrive. This profound military evolution was, fortunately, accompanied by a slow but incredibly profound shift in the very concept of childhood itself. Over the centuries that followed the medieval era, society began a gradual, almost imperceptible, move away from the long-held view of children as merely miniature adults, little more than small laborers, and toward a burgeoning recognition of their unique vulnerability, their inherent innocence, and their distinct developmental needs. The radical idea that a child possessed an inherent right to an education, a life largely free from the trauma of violence, and a protected period of innocence and play before the crushing responsibilities of adulthood descended upon them, was a slow-growing notion that took many centuries to fully take root and permeate societal consciousness. This evolving attitude, a quiet but profoundly impactful social revolution, inexorably helped to delegitimize the casual use of children in combat. While this societal shift was far from perfect and certainly did not instantly erase all forms of child labor or suffering, it gradually created a new moral framework, a burgeoning sense of collective conscience, in which the deliberate and systematic use of children in war was no longer an accepted or tolerated practice, but a burgeoning moral outrage. The emergence of humanistic thought, the revolutionary spread of the printing press and widespread literacy, and a slow, gradual increase in broader social consciousness all significantly contributed to this monumental and compassionate change in perspective. The haunting legacy of the medieval child soldier, however, endures in more than just dusty history books. It lives on as a haunting, undeniable contradiction etched into the very values espoused by the era. The chivalric code, the supposed moral compass guiding the actions of the nobility, explicitly preached the paramount importance of protecting the innocent and the defenseless, of upholding justice and mercy. Yet, as we have seen in the heart-wrenching stories of the peasant levies and the anonymous archerboys, the widespread, systemic use of child soldiers was a stark, undeniable contradiction to this very code, revealing the profound hypocrisy and tragic limitations of the age's lofty ideals. The noble narrative of glorious self-sacrifice and honor was, in retrospect, merely a thin, transparent veil drawn over a brutal, unspeakable reality. This enduring legacy also includes the uncounted, unfathomable psychological and physical scars borne by the children who miraculously survived these horrors. Their trauma, a quiet, internal war that never truly ended, was not understood, was never acknowledged, and certainly was never addressed by a society incapable of such empathy. They were simply expected to endure, to bury their searing fear and their profound shock beneath a thick, impenetrable layer of quiet resolve, carrying the crushing weight of their brutal past with them for the entire remainder of their shortened lives. They would live out their days as haunted, deeply damaged men and women, their innocence lost to the battlefield forever, a silent and profound testament to the unglamorous, enduring cost of war, perhaps the most sobering and imperative part of this dark legacy, and the most compelling reason why we must relentlessly study it, is the direct, powerful, and deeply disturbing parallel it draws to the modern world. The story of the medieval child soldier, though a fading shadow from the distant past, has a very real and very brutal echo in contemporary conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Today, tragically, children are still ripped from their homes, separated from their families, and brutally forced into combat by extremist groups, ruthless warlords, and warring factions. They are still used as disposable assets, as terrified spies, as desperate messengers, and as active combatants. Their small, vulnerable bodies a quiet, fleeting testament to the chaos, indifference, and utter brutality of our own age. The very same root causes, abject poverty, systemic political instability, profound social breakdown, and sheer desperation, that drove the widespread use of children in the Middle Ages still tragically drive their use in combat today, with chilling consistency. A child with no food, no hope, and no discernible future is still a prime, easy target for recruitment by unscrupulous armed groups, and a world torn apart by bitter ethnic or religious strife is still, tragically, a world where the lines between combatant and civilian can be terrifyingly, deliberately blurred, leading to the unthinkable. The stories of a 10-year-old boy and a medieval peasant Levi, clutching a rusty scythe, and a 10-year-old boy wielding an AK-47 in a modern conflict are not separate. They are two sides of the same tragic, blood-stained coin, separated only by the passage of time and the increasingly sophisticated tools of violence. We conclude with a final, somber, and deeply necessary thought. The story of the medieval child soldier is not a mere historical curiosity to be filed away and conveniently forgotten. It is a timeless and universally tragic story that serves as a profound reminder that humanity's enduring capacity for violence, and its chilling willingness to inflict that violence on the most innocent and vulnerable members of society, has been a constant, horrifying thread woven throughout the tapestry of history. The terrifying silence of the medieval battlefield, broken only by the guttural shouts of men and the heart-wrenching cries of dying children, is a haunting echo that we must never, under any circumstances, allow ourselves to forget. For in meticulously remembering their stories, in unflinchingly understanding the horrific conditions that created them, we can hope to one day, through collective will and tireless effort, finally break the cycle and ensure that the shadow of the child soldier, whether medieval or modern, at last fades into the silent, unwritten pages of history, never to return.